Hello, I'm Tamara Copeland, President of the Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers, an organization that we affectionately call WRAG. We support the philanthropic sector in Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and in the District of Columbia. In 2016, we embarked upon a learning journey to explore the depth and breadth and impact of structural racism and implicit bias. We called it Putting Racism on the Table. 2 years later, we asked our members if this learning journey had made a difference. We were pleased when they reported that 36% are now doing their grant making using a racial equity lens, and an additional 34% is considering that strategy. And while we know that philanthropy can definitely be catalytic, we also know that philanthropy alone will not make this a racially equitable region. So we have partnered with Leadership Greater Washington to expand the table for racial equity. We are joining with nonprofit leaders and with business leaders to again look at issues around structural racism and implicit bias. We are delighted that you are a part of this learning journey. Next, we will have an interview with Inca Mohamed talking about how to build community around a conversation for racial equity. So Inca, today we started our learning journey. We had about 80 people in the room from multiple sectors trying to build a sense of community. Was that the right thing to do? Was this the right place to start?
At the very least, I knew that it would be good. It exceeded my expectations. People really appreciated, at least what people came up and said to me, the opportunity to connect with each other, to have a sense of what the rest of the journey was going to feel like. I think also having a sense of how I was going to show up as a facilitator. Could they have the confidence that they could speak up?
So if someone is thinking about starting this type of a learning journey, what's your opinion? Is it better to start with a single sector, or is it better to start with multiple sectors the way we're doing now?
I don't think it's an either or. Having been in philanthropy and knowing the challenges in philanthropy of really acknowledging race and racism, having everybody in that first session come out of philanthropy was really helpful because people were able to see where their colleagues were, as opposed to if there were organizations in there who have a different purpose, who function differently. What that dialogue would have been, because the organizations would have been, this is what we need, and if funders would only recognize this could make a difference. It's one kind of dialogue. It's very different when funders are talking to each other and sharing their challenges with their board, bringing their board along, where their staff is. So I don't think that it's an either or.
If you do choose to start with a group that is from multiple sectors and you recognize the need to build a sense of trust and to build community, what would you suggest as the core requirements for doing that kind of work in a relatively short period of time?
Well, it's interesting about building trust. I often get calls as a facilitator, come and help us build trust. The reality about how trust is really built is from what people actually experience. Okay? So having opportunities for people to share with each other, because it's less about us and more about them talking with each other. And I think over time, as this series continues, is that people will experience being able to speak their truth, and while people might be challenged by it, I think we've set a tone of what that challenge should be like. The difference between calling people in versus calling people out. So it's what is going to happen over the next 6 months is really what's going to build trust.
People seem to resonate when you use the term calling people in. What does that mean, and why did you use that phrase?
Well, I think probably everybody past a certain age who has engaged in any kind of workshop training having to do with race, racism, gender issues, LGBT issues, have probably had an experience where they've said something and people responded to them in a very hostile manner that was really pointing out of, oh, how wrong you are. Now, I don't want to suggest that in these settings, if people say things that are hurtful, that they should not be addressed. But I think it's a matter of all of us being conscious of if we make a mistake, and we all will make mistakes, how would we like to have that mistake brought out to us? And extending that then to another person.
The first two topics that we're exploring are structural racism and white privilege. And we know that these are topics that may have minefields. So if you were giving advice to someone who was going to facilitate this conversation, perhaps someone who's not a professional facilitator, what would be your guidance?
To recognize that those are painful topics. So the structural racism, as the story is told about how a system has been set up to basically keep Black people down, and others, but focusing here in terms of where we have the most history, the longest history. And not forgetting, it's important also when the one that we speak about, because I always feel that there's a way that we tend to make Native people invisible. So again, I just want to be clear about that you are talking about Native people who you're sitting on their land, and what that must feel like, and then the history of the way that structural racism has operated. And to know that there will be people in there who, it's one thing to think you know it, but then when you really hear how systems have been set up, it's going to be painful. And similarly for white people, and it's funny because this came up recently, white people don't think of themselves as having privilege. People think of privilege as extra. So it's very hard for white people to accept that they do have privilege. Another way that I've heard people talk about it is people who have been overly advantaged and people who've been overly disadvantaged. So sometimes that terminology might be helpful because privilege tends to have a certain connotation.
Right.
So when I'm working and there's working class white people in the room, it's hard for them to wrap their hands around, like, how have I been privileged, right? But I think you can show where, by virtue of being white, you have been overly advantaged through no choice of your own necessarily, but the way things have been set up.
I noticed that when you started the series of exercises today, that you started with a fairly innocuous question. You asked the participants why they were named what they are. And then you moved into more difficult questions. Is that basic facilitation skills, or is that facilitation when the topic is one such as race?
Yeah. That is basic facilitation, that you start with something that is safer, a little less safer, and then maybe even a little less safer, so that people begin to feel comfortable talking with each other. So by the time you're getting to the heavier questions, there is some comfort there in, I've talked to this person, I can take a risk at this one.
So, Inca, do you have any guidance for someone who's trying to build a sense of community among participants? What are those core requirements?
Actually giving participants time to talk to each other. So if you notice the first hour, I just had people talking to each other, not me talking to them. And that was part of helping to create a group. And also, it's a chance for the facilitator to get a sense of who's in the room. What issues should I be aware of, right? So I think that's one piece. I think then going into, here's the information I want to present to you. And if time allows, and it should, give people a chance to respond to that information. So we showed a video. I did in my business what we called a lecturette, a small lecture, and then had people respond to what it is that they had heard.
So, Inca, you know that we're doing 5 sessions in our learning journey: structural racism, white privilege, implicit bias, the role of government, and the role of regionalism. And that's the model that RAG has chosen to pursue. But what is the guidance that you would give to someone else who was embarking upon a learning journey? They may not want to replicate our model. What would you suggest to them?
Well, I think you have kind of set the bar in terms of the topics that should be addressed. Structural racism sets a foundation, helps people to develop a common language, addressing white privilege, the existence of white supremacy, being able to say that word. So the thing is that you can't just talk about structural racism without talking about how it gets played out. So I imagine there are people who would like to skip the white privilege part, but you really can't skip that, because that is part of the reality of how things shake out. And what excites me about where the work is now is that when I first started in this work, the focus was on the Black people or the people of color. What is it that they needed to know? How did they need to change? Now it's about, what do white people need to know? How do white people need to change? So it's changing the dialogue and spreading responsibility more appropriately. So you can't get away from that. I think the other part where when you had Manuel Pasteur and now on regionalism, which really makes it concrete, is the fact that we have multiple conversations about race and racism in this country. People tend to, for very good reasons, because of who do you see, what do the numbers tell you, focus on the Black-white conversation. But it's really important to be able to hold the multiple conversations. What is the Asian American experience? Again, what about Native people? And I think Manuel Pestre said something really important at the last session where when he was talking about the diversity of the U.S. population, how everybody might not be in the room, but it's important for you to raise up what would be important for who's not in the room. So I think that's a piece that's really essential.
So Inca, you know that sometimes these are difficult conversations. What is the guidance that you would give when the conversation does move to a place that may be somewhat uncomfortable?
It's important to be transparent about that and to not skip it. That's really critical, because then there's kind of no coming back from that. There were a number of things that were said today that I know pushed some people's buttons, and they later on came up and told me that their buttons got pushed. It's important about it to be transparent. Recently, and this was not a conversation about race, but I was facilitating a meeting where I was using an exercise that a colleague had developed based on the Lakota Indians' use of the 4 directions to identify team archetypes. And I've used this exercise a lot, but I've always been a little uncomfortable about it, because as a Black person who have seen so much of the cultures I come from be appropriated, have always gone, what role am I playing here? And at this meeting, as it turned out, there was a Native woman who at a certain point said, I cannot continue to participate. And then I went to her at the break to ask her, could you tell me some more? And she explained to me that it was difficult for her to participate in this exercise out of context, because these ideas here fall within a particular cultural view, and to have it pulled out like this wasn't comfortable. I apologized to her, asked her if she wanted to say something when we came back, and she said no, and she was totally right, that was my responsibility as the facilitator. And so we came back, we did finish our work, and then I said to the group, this is what happened. I apologized, and I don't know if I would use that exercise again.
But what that says to me is the real importance of having facilitation skills. Because, I think it does, because I think that someone who is empathetic, you can be caring, you can really be committed to a social justice and a racial justice agenda. But if you don't have the necessary facilitation skills, the conversation may not go to the place where you want it to.
It's already hard having somebody who is trained and is part of an organization doing this work, because, where does their voice come in, and what do they have to manage, and what's the hierarchy? Who's going to tell the boss, stop talking? So I think there's a lot of challenges there. So I think some of the things that can be considered is whether an organization might be able to, as we used to say in California, have an energy exchange with another organization, where somebody from that organization could come and facilitate a meeting for them, and somebody from their organization can go and facilitate a meeting for another organization. I also think that there are organizations out there who this is part of their mission. And so there may be people who they could get who would come and do it at no cost. But I have to say, in a lot of the cases that I've seen where people have tried to do this without good facilitation training, it can backfire.
That would be my fear.
And when it doesn't something that falls easily into a do-over. It can, linger in the environment.
Well, it's such a conversation that we haven't had. And then to start it and for it to move to a place that's not productive really speaks to the need for a facilitator who can keep the conversation on track.
Well, I'm happy to say there's a lot of resources out there. There's a number of guides that are out there that are free that you could get started with. And there's also a film by a woman named Shakti Butler called Cracking the Code. And there's snippets of it on YouTube, but I think getting the film is a good investment. And they actually have a sliding scale depending upon the organization for you to purchase it. And they also have a discussion guide. The good thing about this film is that it covers all of the issues that you're covering with our sessions.
Wow.
And these are in maybe about 20 minutes. There's a talk, and then there's a little vignette, and then it pauses automatically so that you can then do the discussion. So just being able to take that film and facilitate a film like that is a good starting point, because people then could identify, I really want to learn more about this, I want to learn more about the other, and then you can go about designing a session that helps to dig deeper. But there are resources out there, and another important resource is the Racial Equity Tools. It's a wonderful website that has materials that go from educating, planning, to action.
That sounds like a perfect place to end. I want to thank you for your time and thank you for your stewardship of our project. Thanks, Inca.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you to United Philanthropy Forum for making the videos possible. With every video, there's a viewing guide and a discussion guide to facilitate your use of this resource. I really want to thank you for being a part of this learning series, for being a part of expanding the table for racial equity. And in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Thank you.